Hello and welcome to another weekly best of three sideboard guide. This week, the Demir Midrange won the vote here on YouTube. And so this one is going to be the tournament winner from the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online, or MODO. And it was the one that kind of took a new approach to the archetype. And so on Sunday, I'm going to be going over some of the ones that had won this week in week 4. So this is a little bit of a throwback, but we're seeing some new inclusions that we haven't really seen in your typical Dimir mid-range list, such as Lasav, where faces, which can copy something in a graveyard and become a copy of it. The Invasion of Amonkhet, which if you flip it becomes a 4/4 zombie that copies something in the graveyard as well. So there's a little bit of that theme going on there. And then we've also seen Ledger Shredder, allows you to connive so that you can discard something interesting into your graveyard. And if you have like the Akhlazot's, so in the sideboard here we've got the Akhlazot's Deepest Betrayal. You can copy the Invasion of Amonkhet into that, and then when Akhlazot's dies, it says it transforms into the flipped side of the Temple of the Dead. And so what happens with the Invasion of Amonkhet is that it flips over and you get basically to pick another 4/4. So like there's some really cool synergies that this deck is doing that we haven't really seen in other archetypes. Other than that, though, I mean, we've got like the Deep Cavern Bat, we've got the Make Disappear, Cut Down, Go for the Throat. A lot of cards that we are used to seeing. The Spyglass Siren and the Deep Cavern Bat are particularly good at getting in early damage to give us draw off of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. And then we've got the Subterranean Schooner, which can make your flyers into a bigger threat, and giving your Deep Cavern Bat that +1/+1 and giving it lifelink for future times by exploring after you crew the Subterranean Schooner can just leave some decks in the dust, right? So it's a mid-range deck, but it's often very tempo, right? Another one that we got that was new was the Cryptic Coat. So this one was bringing in 3 copies of the Cryptic Coat, which is a nice recurring threat. You get a 3/2 Ward 2 disguised cloaked creature that then you can do 1 and a blue to return the equipment back to your hand and then play it again. So yeah, you get another cloaked card, and then as long as, if they destroy the creature, the equipment just falls to the battlefield and you can bring it back. So it makes artifact hate a little bit more necessary. As far as the, and 1 copy of Gix's Command for a little bit of life gain and a board wipe against like the Boros Convoke strategies. So this deck is running 2 Disdainful Strokes, 2 Tishana's Tidebinders, 3 Glistening Deluge, which is supposed to be this like one-sided board wipe where your creatures survive the -1/-1, and then all of those white Boros Convoke creatures get -3/-3, and so you just get like this one-sided board wipe. 1 copy of Virtue of Persistence, which gives us a nice like mid-range threat, but also gives us some early interaction and stabilization against very aggressive strategies. We've got 1 more copy of Cut Down for some more early interaction, 1 copy of Dreams of Steel and Oil for some artifact or creature specific hate, 2 copies of Duress to snipe things like Sunfall from your opponent's hand, Disdainful Stroke for the 2nd copy of Disdainful Stroke for against Domain, for example, Unlicensed Hearse for a little bit of eliminating the graveyard reanimator strategies. We've started to see a couple pop up here and there. Akhlazot's Deepest Betrayal, which we're going to cover the specific matchups here, what the data is showing, and then a 2nd copy of the Gix's Command. So with that, we're going to go through and I'm going to look at like the tracker data and what the data is saying, which cards are good for which specific matchups. And since it is kind of a new take on Dimir midrange, though, the data is a little sparse. So we're going to see. I do still think there's some interesting insights in doing this process. And so remember to put up a vote for next week, what archetype you'd like to see. And yeah, so let's get started. All right, so here it is, the Dimir midrange best of 3 sideboard guide based off of tracker data from Untapped. So what I like to do here is I like to look at the most common matchups in the Magic the Gathering tournament scene according to MTG Goldfish, which covers a variety of Magic the Gathering tournaments, one of which is my favorite, which is the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. So number 1, we saw briefly last week, we saw Boros Convoke kind of come in and take the number 1 spot for the most popular archetype to bring to the tournaments. but Esper Midrange has taken it back. And so this one is the most common one, at least in the tournament scene. And this is what I mean by the data is relatively low for this archetype. You can see here that the matches are not even at 200. So take everything here with a grain of salt. This is supposed to be a useful exercise and a way to help you kind of develop a better best of 3 sideboard and understanding of the archetype. It's not something to, say that like this is written in stone and this is clearly the right way to go about things. Magic the Gathering is a complex game, and there's lots of rights and wrongs, right? So one thing that we can see from here is that Cut Down is doing relatively well, so we could bring in an additional copy of Cut Down against Esper Midrange. Kind of makes sense. We can hit Raffine. Raffine's a good target. And then the lowest performing card here is Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. And Esper Midrange is really good at drawing cards off of the Connive, off of Raffine, and the Fairy Mastermind, etc. So trying to win our own card advantage battles is not as important. So it kind of makes sense that the Gix Yawgmoth Praetor would be the lowest card on the list. And then we've got a problem here with low data. So the rest of the list, all really no suggestions coming from there. So what we can do though is we can look at what are the Dimir midrange decks doing outside of the list, and this is a good way to check for what are some common cards that people like to include that are not being included in the list. And we can see that there are 2 missing options. One is Fairy Mastermind, and the other one is Urtai Resurrected. And they synergize nicely together because Urtai Resurrected makes them draw a card after you destroy a creature or counter spell, and Fairy Mastermind draws you a card if your opponent draws a second card. So as long as you're countering their spell on their turn, then you get to draw a card along with them, and you can kind of offset the disadvantage of Urtai Resurrected. And then we can also expand the list of the cards included to all archetypes, so not just specifically for Dimir midrange, but how has Shieldred been doing in all of the archetypes. And we can see that there's still relatively a low amount of data for black archetypes in general. Most of the stuff on the tracker has been focused on Boros Convoke, which is why yesterday I did my deep dive into the data, and it was a lot of fun. And but here we can see that Gix's command is on the list, but it is performing worse than Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. So probably not worth bringing in the Gix's command. So yeah, so my quick, based off the data, what I would suggest doing in this matchup is cut 1 Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, bring in 1 Cut Down, and then note that Mastermind and Urtai are missing from the list. Once again, I'll mention again, the Cut Down is particularly good because it hits Raffine, and then Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, card advantage is less important because of how good Esper midrange is at drawing cards. As far as Boros Convoke is concerned, we kind of repeat the same process here, and we can see that there are a fair amount of cards in the sideboard that could be brought in to fight this matchup. So we could bring in the 1 Virtue of Loyalty, or Persistence, the +2 Disdainful Strokes, the +1 Gix's Command, the +2 Tidebinders, as well as the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal. And as far as the worst performing cards go, we can see that Ledger Shredder here is not performing particularly well against the Boros Convoke, which, a 1/3 flyer. The problem with Boros Convoke is that it goes wide very well. So cards that are really good at blocking one thing, but not necessarily trading and getting rid of that, are problematic as the Boros army will slowly start to overwhelm you. And then we've also got the Invasion of Amonkhet, which is not particularly good at, it's a slower strategy. And same with Lasav, Wearer of Faces. It has the same issue that the Ledger Shredder does, which is it blocks really well. It's good, in other aggro matchups, less so when your opponent is going wide. The alternative strategies for, alternative archetypes, the alternative missing options, we've got Kaido Shizuki, is an option that could be an interesting one to bring in future iterations. We've got Lord Skitter Sewer King, which is you've seen in some Demir midrange lists, as well as Bitter Triumph. And so those could be options worth exploring. And then here, if we open things up to include all archetypes, we can see that Shieldred the Apocalypse is the top performing card. And so from this, we can kind of build a strategy around Let's bring in the 1 copy of Virtue, the 2 Disdainful Strokes, the Gix's Command, the Tidebinder, Aclazotz, cut the Shredders, cut the Invasion of Amonkhet, and cut the 2 copies of Lisov. And notably, we could bring in the Planeswalker and play around with the idea of Lord Skitter or Bitter Triumph. So Virtue Persistence is kind of like against mono red. It's really good for the early removal and life gain, less so for playing it as a 7-cost card. The game will probably be over by the time that you hit 7 mana. And then Disdainful Stroke can be played in response to a Knight Errant of Eos. Even though they're not paying the mana, you know, it still has a mana value of 6, I think, if I can remember, 5. Anyway, you can hit it with the Disdainful Stroke. So blocking their Knight Errant of Eos is kind of like the main thing that we want to try to do. And Tishana's Tidebinder is also good for that, blocking the Knight Errant of Eos. And then you can also block Immodane's Recruiter for the Enter the Battlefield effects. We're going to bring in the 2 copies of the Tishana's Tidebinder. Aclazotz, Deepest Betrayal, we're going to bring in... It's similar to mono red. The lifelink off of Aclazotz is particularly good if we can survive with our cut downs in our early interaction to get to the stabilization of Aclazotz, Deepest Betrayal. And then, like I mentioned, Ledger Shredder is just even though Boros Convoke will be double spelling often, they will quickly go wide, where having a single good blocker won't really matter. And then Invasion of Amonkhet, bringing back a 1/1 or 1/2, bringing back a Voldaren Epicure is not very impressive, and we'd rather be developing the board or disrupting their curve out from being able to hit the Knight Errant of Eos. And same thing goes for Lisov, where faces, similarly to the Amonkhet, the options in the graveyard are not very impressive, and then having an early blocker is not as good as as you will see. It's much better against something like mono red, where the 2/3 body matters a lot more. And then versus Azorius Control. So it's crazy to see Azorius Control in so much popularity and doing quite well in the tournament so early on. I've been just kind of like, whoa. Usually you see that come in a little bit later into the format, because we saw it as early as like week 1, week 2, right? So against Azorius Control, the top performing card is Cryptic Coat, which is cool, right? It gives us some options for the new archetype that is blowing up everywhere, especially on the best of 3 ladder. And Cut Down was one that definitely caught my attention as I would not have suspected that, but the second performing card in the archetype is Cut Down. And then as far as the worse options go, here we've got the Invasion of Amonkhet. Again, that's better, the bigger creature threats that we have to copy. And then Aclazotz and Tishana's Tidebinder are already in the sideboard, so but we could play around with the idea of bringing out Spyglass Siren. And then we run into the no data issue. And then if we look at alternative strategies, still Cryptic Code at the top of the list. But we see that Preacher of the Schism is pretty decent, and that one's one that we've seen quite commonly in the Demir and Golgari midrange that could be worth exploring, bringing back in, as well as the Fairy Mastermind and Malcolm. So if you're having a particularly hard time with control, you may want to explore the Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel, because if they can't disrupt it, Malcolm can absolutely just pop off. And then as if we open it up to include all archetypes, we can see Duress here at the top of the list. And that's a classic one. The more that they're playing spells, and Azorius Control is pretty much all spells, then Duress becomes worth playing, and you can like get rid of one of their wraths and hopefully get enough pressure in early. So my strategy here would be to bring in 1 Cut Down and bring in the 2 Duress, and then cut the Invasion of Amonkhet and the 1 copy of the Spyglass Siren. Notably, we're missing Preacher, Mastermind, and Malcolm, and you might think that Cut Down is a little bit of a strange inclusion if the list is not running any creatures, but I've found that Cut Down works really well against the 1/1s off of Sunset Revelry, the 2/2s off of Wandering Emperor, as well as hitting the 2/3 Azorius Manland that produces map tokens, the Restless Anchorage. So Cut Down might perform better than you're anticipating, right? Like, I could see somebody deciding to bring out Cut Down because usually you think of early creature threats. But this is actually a good way to push damage, potentially. Duress is a classic black anti-control sideboard option that we could bring in to attack their hand. Invasion of Amonkhet. There are no good creatures to reanimate, especially if all of yours have been exiled by Sunfall, or if all of the graveyards have been wiped through Farewell. That one makes sense to cut. And then Spyglass Siren, Control is looking to trade 1-for-1 outside of board wipes, so we want our cards to be doing a little bit more than what Spyglass Siren is offering, although it does synergize with Gix Yawgmoth Praetor to give us some card advantage. We just kind of want our cards to be bringing a little bit more to the table against this archetype. And then for Domain, we can see here that we've got Subterranean Schooner at the top of the list, largely because Subterranean Schooner dodges Sunfall. The vehicles are nice to have in that situation. We've also got the one copy of Cutdown should probably be brought in since it's the 4th performing card. And then Gix Yawgmoth Praetor here, again at the bottom of the list. And then we hit into no data. And then as far as alternative strategies go here, no new cards that are that aren't already involved in the list. And then for all archetypes, we can see that Make Disappear is particularly good and is common to bring in something like Disdainful Stroke to counter the board wipe, because if you can counter the Sunfall, Domain is kind of ramping to Sunfall as their main strategy. So the sideboard strategy against Domain is to bring in one copy of Cutdown, cut one copy of the Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, and notably there weren't really any missing options for this matchup. And Cutdown does hit 1/1s off of Courier's Briefcase, but that is not in every list that Domain runs. So this one, pay attention to what your Domain player is playing and whether or not Cutdown has a good target. I do think that this might be just a little bit of an artifact in the data, because, like I said, there are some lists where Cutdown is just not going to hit anything and be kind of a dead card, unless I'm forgetting something, right? It doesn't hit like the Topiary Stompers, so... but if they are running the Courier's Briefcase, that can help you get through, and like if they are bringing in sideboard, they might sideboard in the Courier's Briefcase because Demir midrange tends to be more towards the aggro side of things, and so to bring in the 1/1s that are good blockers. And Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, we need to close the game out before they hit Sunfall, less so outvalue them from card advantage. So notably, Disdainful Stroke probably should be brought in this matchup, but the data are missing. And then versus Demir midrange, we can, so against the mirror match, we can see that Cutdown is the 4th performing card. Again, another issue with like low sample size. This will improve with time. But we can bring out the Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, and then potentially play around with the idea of cutting one Shieldred the Apocalypse. Notably, this does seem like a favorable matchup, which is to say that the improvements that the deck has made to the Demir midrange archetype have been better than the previous versions. And so I like the direction that they're taking it. I think that you've got some signs here that the deck is performing better than the previous version. And then we hit into the low sample size and alternative strategies, though. Again, nothing really stands out here than what we've already got going, which is a good sign. And then if we open it up to all archetypes, we can see that Gix's Command could be a thing to explore, as well as Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal and Virtue of Persistence. So my strategy here would be to bring in the additional Cutdown, bring in the Gix's Command, bring in the Aclazot's of Deepest Betrayal, and then bring in the Virtue of Persistence. Cut the 3 copies of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, and cut 1 copy of Shieldred. And Cutdown slows the early pressure in the mirror match, disrupts the Deep Cavern Bats, makes it more difficult. And then Gix's Commands lets us reset and gives us lifelink, which can be really important in the mirror match. And then Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, similar to how against Boros Convoke and against the earlier pressure, the more aggressive strategies, if you can survive to getting to your Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, then you gain that stabilization and lifelink. And if it does come down to kind of like you're both doing the same thing, I think that this deck gains that edge by bringing in the Invasion of Amonkhet and doing the cool like Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal interaction where the copy comes back after it dies. So as far as what we can cut, though, the matchup is too very fast-paced decks, so the card advantage and the life loss from Gix is less important. We really want to preserve our life total, and there's definitely a card in the deck that is worse than Shieldred to cut here, but it's the one that the data that has data and that has performed worse than the cards that we're bringing in. You know, with time, I imagine there's a better substitution here than Shieldred the Apocalypse. Versus mono red aggro, we can see that Gix's command here is at the top of the list, followed by Virtue of Persistence, and then Cut Down. We should probably bring in another copy of Cut Down. And then as far as the cards that are not performing very well, we can see a larger sample size in the tracker against mono red aggro. Tends to be a more popular matchup. Invasion of Amonkhet is down on the bottom where we think it should be because it is for slower matchups. And then Cryptic Coat is also not performing particularly well in this archetype, or in this matchup, I should say. And then, yeah, Disdainful Stroke coming here at the bottom of the list. And then alternative strategies, we do see a couple of missing options. So we see the Preacher of the Schism. We see Kaido Shizuki, very bottom there. And then we see Sleep Cursed Fairy, which is not one that we've really seen anywhere else. So that one was kind of like a, huh. Interesting that they were bringing in Sleep Cursed Fairy, but specifically only against mono red. And then versus mono red aggro, for all archetypes, then we can see that there's nothing else outside of the list that's popping out. So my sideboard strategy here would be to bring in one copy of Gix's command, one copy of Virtue of Persistence, one copy of Cut Down, cut the 2 copies of Invasion of Amonkhet, and 1 Cryptic Coat. Gix's command helps stabilize with the lifelink, very similar to the Demir midrange matchup, while also wiping your opponent's board. That is to say, if we can make it to turn 5. So, not the easiest task against mono red. Virtue of Persistence is great removal for hitting something like Squee or Godric and gains you that 2 life, which can be really helpful at stabilizing. Cut Down, we need every little bit of cheap interaction to try to survive to playing Gix's command. And notably, Aclazotz used to be a good card to bring in against mono red, but there have been enough Witchstalker's Frenzies brought into the main that I think that its win rate has taken a nosedive, since it doesn't gain life when it enters the battlefield, and you're not really going for the recurring loop as the game goes on longer. So, but I would cut the Invasion of Amonkhet for slower matchups where we want to out-tempo a mid-range deck by stealing something that they've milled at a faster tempo than they are playing it. Not a great card against aggro. And then Cryptic Coat similarly is also for these more grindy matchups, because you get the upside of this is that it's unblockable. The downside is that it's a 3/2 stat block for 3. And so it's not going to block well, right? You're playing a 3-costed card and it can't, it trades with a 2/2 Grizzly Bear. And so its recurring value is better in longer matchups, where you get more synergies off the cloak and more just off of the unblockable damage in general. Versus Golgari midrange, we can see the Cut Down again here is at the top of the list, or number 2. And then as far as the worst performing card, we've got the Invasion of Amonkhet, and then it hits into no data. And no alternative strategies here, looking at alternative lists. And then if we look at the archetype all with the same list, we can see Virtue of Persistence pops to the top. So bringing in the 1 copy of the Virtue of Persistence could be good against the Golgari midrange. So my strategy here would be to bring in the 1 copy of Cut Down, the 1 copy of Virtue of Persistence, cut the 2 copies of Invasion of Amonkhet. And the reason for this is Cut Down, we've seen this before, interrupting Golgari's early turns like Mosswood Dreadknight and Deep Cavern Bat is a good thing. And so having 4 copies of Cut Down gets the thumbs up. Virtue of Persistence does the same kind of early disruption as well, while then also becoming a late game winner. Golgari midrange tends to be a very grindy matchup, so I was kind of surprised to see Invasion of Amonkhet on the bottom here. But the more that I thought about it, Golgari midrange isn't running any huge bombs to copy. It has some decent targets, but nothing that is just like a game-winning bomb. And it's Golgari midrange is playing more of a grindy, I'm going to eventually outvalue you kind of strategy, which Invasion of Amonkhet will help us by attacking their hand. But Golgari is so good at the late game that we have a better shot if we focus on our tempo and applying early pressure and overrunning Golgari midrange. Versus Rakdos midrange, we've got Cut Down again is making it into the top 8 performing cards here, and then Gix Yawgmoth Praetor on the bottom. And we've seen this kind of trend before, where like the decks that include Cut Downs and Gix Yawgmoth Praetor tend to want all 4 cut downs in, and Gix tends to be on the bottom. And it's been kind of my experience with it too, is that like Gix reads better maybe than it actually plays. But it does have its advantages in certain matchups where you're trying to outvalue your opponent through card draw. And then yeah, when we hit into no data, alternative strategies here, we're missing the Fairy Mastermind and Urtai Resurrected. So if you are going to bring in the old Urtai Resurrected and Fairy Mastermind, there are the Rakdos midrange as well as the previous one would be a good one to bring in that duo. So I like the idea of maybe playing around with that as a sideboard option. And then we can see here, if we open it up to all archetypes, that Tishana's Tidebinder makes it into the top 5, or number 4. So it could be an interesting one to bring in. And it kind of makes sense too, right? Oop, sorry, typo. Avoid the missing, or ignore the missing. So I'd bring in 1 cut down, 2 copies of the Tishana's Tidebinder, and cut the 3 copies of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. And so Cut Down can remove threats like Blood Tithe Harvester, the Deep Cavern Bat, and Tishana's Tidebinder makes a lot of sense because it can turn off the Cruelty of Gix or a Trumpeting Carnosaur. So both of these seem like good tools to bring in against this matchup in the Rakdos midrange. And then we, again, kind of want to end the game before they start looping off with Cruelty of Gix. So again, outvaluing them with the card advantage from Gix is a little bit less important. And on a side note, could remove 1 copy of Make Disappear for 1 Virtue of Persistence. I do think that that's kind of supported in the data. And Rakdos really does struggle against enchantments. They don't really have any destroy enchantment. Their best bet is the Edict that I'm blanking on the name of, but I've covered it in previous episodes. And the one that like you can make them discard a creature or an enchantment is part of the card as well. It's one of those dual functions. Anyway, so you could bring in the Virtue of Persistence here. I prefer to try to counterspell the Cruelty of Gix personally, so I decided against it. The overall impressions of going through this is it's very low data. It's very new, and also unlike Boros Convoke, which like everybody is playing, Demir midrange is a little bit of off the beaten path, right? So this will improve over time if the archetype does take off in popularity, or even if we just give it a month and kind of revisit it and see what it's going, see what the data has suggested over time. And there are no missing options that are just like screaming at me like there were in Boros Convoke, where I was like, why is Sanguine Evangelist not in the main for Boros? But I do think that there is some room here to still play around. And some of the sideboarding options like the Fairy Mastermind and the Urtai Resurrected against Rakdos and Esper midrange, those could be interesting ones to bring back in, at least maybe in the sideboard. I don't know. I'm not against that sort of like type of sideboard though. And I think a copy or 2 of Kaido Shizuki could be a nice option as well against mono red aggro and the Boros Convoke strategies. Because if you can kind of get them to not, look over here and attack the Planeswalker instead of your life total, and then if they don't attack it, you're also getting that card advantage, I think maybe better than you are getting from Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, or at least not at the cost of life. And so it's kind of giving you that same thing that Gix is giving you, but in a different way. So I think it could be an interesting one to explore. Preacher of the Schism or Malcolm, if you're bumping into or expecting a bunch of Azorius control in your matchups, could also be a good one to explore. Both of those, I think, give you a better edge against the Azorius control lists. So if you've made it to this point, thank you very much for listening to my best of 3 sideboard guide for Dimir midrange. I hope it gave you some interesting insights. And please let me know what has been working for you and what you thought of the overall, if you think it's way off, if you think it's like got some useful stuff. I always enjoy hearing it. It lets me know that like this was worthwhile and worth doing. So sideboards always make interesting discussions as well. And This is a weekly series, so if you'd like more content like this in the future, remember to click like and subscribe. And don't forget to place your vote for next week's archetype. And good luck crushing your matches, climbing the ladder, or playing in your RCQs.